Good morning for those in Brazil and US. Good evening for those in China, in Shanghai. My name is Giuseppe Borges. I'm the chairman of the board of trustees of CEBRI. And it is my great pleasure to open CEBRI's 21st China Analysis Group meeting, which will be held will be the last session of 2020. This session, we will discuss multilateral development banks with focus at the NDB and the AIIB, and the importance, their importance in a Brazilian strategy of development. Sorry. We would like to thank our partners, BBM BOCOM, for their help in supporting the China Analysis Group. And I also would like to thank our distinguished panelists, who will be properly introduced by Tatiana. It's an honor to have you here today. Mr. Leslie Marsdorf from the New Development Bank, Mr. Joaquin von Amsberg from the IIB, Martin Reiser, a friend from the World Bank, who left Brazil, unfortunately, Karen Vasquez from the Fudan University, and Rogério Studart, Senior Fellow of CEBRI, and also Senior Fellow of the World Resources Institute. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. But most of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Tatiana Rosito immensely for all her work that she's done conducting the China Analysis Group since the inception in 2017 until October, when she joined the New Development Bank. The China Analysis Group is part of CEBRI's Asia program, which is coordinated by our trustee, Professor Ana Jaguaribe. Since it was created, it has been monitoring the relationship between China and Brazil and helping Brazilians to understand more about China and Asia in general. Since September 2017, we had 20 meetings such as this, and more than 2,000 participants altogether, not including today, of course. The meetings brought together participants from Brazil, from different countries, and it was immensely helpful to understand better the relationship between Brazil and China and Asia in general. Since until March of this year, the meetings were held through video conference in 6 cities simultaneously: Rio, São Paulo, Brasília, Washington, New York, Shanghai, and Beijing. And then since then, we've been holding these meetings through Zoom. In 2020, we had 4 excellent meetings. The first dealing with Brazil-China relations in times of managed trade and COVID. The second, Asian production chains and technological decoupling trends, the tech decoupling. The third on artificial intelligence, technological warfare, and changes in global order. And the fourth on conflict and cooperation in Asia, geopolitical issues. This is the 5th and last. Other topics that were discussed along these 20 meetings were Xi Jinping's leadership and the 19th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, China's presence in Latin America, financing and participation in infrastructure, US-China trade war, Made in China 2025, Belt and Road Initiative, China as a military power, Brazil and China facing global environmental challenges. In the name of CEBRI, we would like to thank you, Tatiana, immensely for your fantastic job that you have done throughout these years leading the China Analysis Group program. Thank you very much. And I pass the word to you to introduce the panelists and the work of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pio. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me also to do this very brief farewell remarks. I am touched by your words. I actually also have had along these 3 years immense, I had immense learning and satisfaction from leading the China Analysis Group. I think, like you mentioned, even before the pandemic, we were doing already video conferences and they expanded a lot. We had 50 to 70 participants, Chatham House. Now we have sometimes 400 people and we have an open environment, but we try always to keep the excellence of our speakers. I believe there is no theme of importance for Brazil and China and also globally that we haven't touched, at least. We also have a legacy of structured material for scholars and policymakers with a very policy-oriented view. So I want to be very brief, say that I think this 21st session has turned out even much better than I imagined when I prepared this program in the end of last year. So I'm so happy that we have this host of outstanding speakers today. I want to thank Rogério Studert for accepting also to moderate and conduct this work. Rogério, it's an honor to have you with us today to do this. I also would like to thank the whole team, to thank Pio, Julia, the Board of Trustees for your words, for all the support along the years. Also to thank the team that has always been working with us, and I also wish Philip Young success and happiness in leading as much as I had in leading this group. I'm sure he'll have a fantastic future for our group from next year on. I think actually, Pio, now I would like just to thank again our speakers, and I think between me and Rogério, I'll pass on the word for him to introduce the theme and the speakers, which is more or less, I think, our arrangements. Thank you very much for your words, and I'm looking forward to this session today. And maybe I'll make a question later. Thank you. And just to finish, also, I didn't mention, but I want to thank you very much also, Ana Jaguaribe, for a very fruitful work we have done together. Thanks. Rogério.
Well, thank you, Tatiana.
Good morning.
Well,
Yes.
1 second, Rogério. I forgot to mention, was so emotional about thanking Tatiana, that our senior fellow, Philip Young, will be responsible for the China Analysis Group from 2021. So I wish him all the luck, and I'm sure he's going to do a wonderful job. Thank you. Rogério, please.
Well, thank you, Pio, and thank you, Tatiana, for doing an incredible work. I join my voice to what Pio has said for what I've been observing of the group. Well, I think Joaquin said that it was good to see good friends again, and this is the same case with me. But also, I have to say, as I mentioned before in our preparatory meeting, that this is a topic that for me has some personal and professional linkage that also link myself to Joaquin. I was in 2009, I was representing Brazil and 8 other nations at the World Bank, at the board, when the crisis happened. Actually, with the discussions of the crisis, of course, preceded that. And that it was a very intense moment for all of us, particularly because it was the first crisis of the new globalized world. And it was a crisis that had no precedent except for the crisis in the 1930s. And the experience then was not exactly one that anyone wanted to repeat. And I had at the same time the privilege and the honor to observe from within, particularly from the governance structure, the reaction and kind of the revival of the multilateral system, which was, kind of losing dynamism for a while. And the crisis was quite astonishing in the way that it hit not only the United States where it started, but the waves that it created on trade, on global growth, on jobs. So the response needed to be quite significant for the time, as we perceived it at that time. And for the multilateral world, what it meant was, a new understanding of the need for cooperation among countries in order to address these issues, and particularly in the use of the multilateral systems as policy instruments to coordinate this response. Of course, the World Bank was a central player of that, but also all the Bretton Woods institutions and all the development banks that were related to the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank. So it was a joint effort, and Joaquin was leading a significant part of that crisis response when we saw that. I had then the opportunity to see the response and the fading of the multilateral effort. And the fading of the multilateral effort then, in my view, had to do with 2 things. First, with the national responses. I mean, countries understood that they could resolve that using particularly monetary policy, quantitative easing, which made it the effort towards multilateral cooperation to be less critical in the response afterwards, but which created some problems that we're still trying to address now. The second thing were related to governance issues that were never fully responded in this moment. And that was what the BRICS Bank, at the time was called BRICS Bank, now the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank came about. It was a new thinking of how multilateralism should take place, and those 2 very important institutions were created. Now we face a crisis that, if we look with a hindsight, we look in 2009, the proportion is much more significant. The pandemic created an economic and a social, a health crisis, which is really unprecedented in the 2 last ones. And it's very clear, and the pandemic made it very clear for all of us that there's no way out of this crisis without further cooperation. And particularly, it made us see that there's an additional crisis coming in front of us, which is already evolving very quickly, which is climate change. That is going to present that challenge for our existential challenge for our and future generations. So with that in mind, I want to hope, I'm very optimistic, I want to hope that we're going to have some sort of jumpstart of multilateralism, where institutions like the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the World Bank, of course, will have a fundamental role. This is what I want to frame this discussion, and I'll stop here. How do you think that multilateral is moving in this crisis? Are you as optimistic as I am? Or what are the caveats that you have? How your institutions will play a role in this new phase, and how you see countries like, for instance, Brazil, placing itself better in order to participate in this potential cooperation. I'm co-moderating this panel with Cynthia Hoskinson, and I'll take, what I'll do is I will participate in the first hours, taking notes and raising to myself some questions, and then I'll pass on the moderation with them. Again, it's thank you for the invitation to moderate this. It's truly a pleasure to listen to what you have to say. So I think by the order, Cynthia, would you remind me the order quickly, because I think I had the glitch here in
right. We will start with Mr. Marsdorp from the NBB.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for that. My computer had to go blank exactly the moment that I wanted to introduce you, but I'll work on that. In the meantime, Leslie, please have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rogerio, and thanks very much to CEBRI for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. And thanks also for your opening remarks in setting the scene, because I think it is very appropriate to start at that point. What role has multilateral institutions, multilateral systems as a whole played during this particular crisis, and also just reinforce the importance of multilateralism in the world today? I'd like to start with that, and I think also just briefly place it in historical context. I think we have to remind ourselves that these institutions are only really 75, 76 years old. It's literally as late as 1944, as you know, only when the Bretton Woods summit took place, and out of that, the World Bank, the IMF was born at the same time, the now known as World Trade Organization, and so on. These institutions, without a doubt, Rogerio, have been central to creating the economic peace and prosperity, or the golden age of capitalism that we have seen over the last 7 decades. They are often taken for granted, but they have been central. And that's just one thesis that I would put forward. The second point to make is that they were born out of crises, out of the period to rehabilitate post the Second World War. And it was a specific mandate, actually, of the IBRD, was the reconstruction of Europe. That was actually the core essence of the discussions that took place there in New Hampshire. And in fact, if you want to trace it a little bit further, it was really sort of John Maynard Keynes in 1919 at the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War, who wrote a very interesting piece called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And that is actually the intellectual roots of the multilateral system as we have it today. And as you know, he was a young sort of policymaker in his early 30s, representing the UK government, and he was completely disgusted by the conversations around the extent of reparations on Germany. And the thesis he was putting forward is that after a war, after this destruction and crises, you have to rebuild the peace, and you have to rebuild new institution. And he started to make use of the word reconstruction, and that went into 1944. So over the last 7 decades, 7.5 decades, we had a very successful system that has served us well. However, the system has been successful, and as largely the essential structures have remained in place, but have not taken full account of the changes in the world, especially in the last 3 decades. The most significant development, as you know, in the last 3-4 decades have been the rise of emerging markets. China at the center, but a whole series of other markets, India, Brazil, and so on. Large markets which were relatively insignificant in global terms in the 1940s and the 1950s and so on. And the multilateral system did not sufficiently modify and adjust itself to take account of these new rising powers. So when I think it was then also a very significant moment, obviously in 1999, when the G20 was formed, and you can see how in the 2008-2009 crisis that you made reference to, the single most important institution guiding the world out of that crisis was indeed the G20. So let's fast forward to today in the interest of time. I would say that after 1944, as you know, regional multilateral banks were formed in the 50s and 60s, and then also in the 70s with CAF. And then finally, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development was formed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then the next infusion of multilateral spirit was 2015, when the New Development Bank was formed, as well as the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So that's kind of the history. Let's then go more center stage around China. A couple of comments about China. The single biggest actor on the global stage in terms of the emerging markets naturally today is China. Over the last 40 years, China has achieved spectacular growth. China led a globalization phase that have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in this country. Phenomenal success. I've lived here now for 5.5 years, and I've seen and I've touched and felt the essence of what these policymakers have been able to achieve here. Not just policymakers, but the entrepreneurial spirit of people and the hope that people have in the future is just quite something here in China. I want to make one observation about that, though. There are huge shortcomings about this experiment here in China. The financial, and although China globalized in many respects, opened up and created a huge manufacturing hub for the world, its financial and capital markets remain substantially closed. So there's a whole series of reforms that still need to be undertaken for China to play its full role in the international global financial architecture. So I guess what I'm saying is that the emerging markets have not been fully accommodated in the global financial architecture, but in order for China in particular to take its rightful place, it needs to undertake a whole series of reforms. And we don't have to go into the detail of it now, but it revolves around opening up its financial markets. It revolves around leveling the playing field for foreign companies operating here. I'll give you just one or two little short examples. The banking sector here is 100% almost state-owned. Every commercial bank you go to, Bank of China, ICBC, Bank of Communications, they're all state-owned. When you look at the insurance companies, you look at the hedge fund industry, the entire financial capital markets is still very domestic. I'll give you another quick statistic it's the second largest bond market in the world at $13.3 trillion, but only 2% represent foreign holdings. So 98% of this market is domestic. There's huge space and scope for China to develop further and for the opening up of these markets to be a catalyst for its future growth. Let me now turn in the interest of time to the New Development Bank, and then I'll rapidly move towards a closure. The New Development Bank, as you know, is the creation of BRICS. And it was really born out of, and you were there, so you were part of the founding fathers, it was born out of this desire for emerging markets, for us to stand on our own feet and to play a bigger role in the global economy. And you will see, if you look at the essential construct of the New Development Bank, we looked at how can we replicate the successes of the multilateral banking system, what we have learned over the last 7 decades, and then look at what does technology offer us today, where's the scope for innovation, what can we do different, and what is new, and what will define the multilateral banks of the future. And I'm just going to, because of the lack of time, we won't be able to go into each one of them, but I'll just highlight sort of 4, 5, 6 areas that I think will define where multilateralism is going over the next decade or so. When we formed the New Development Bank, we identified 3 or 4 key aspects that still today form part of the foundations of the bank. The first one is a lean structure. And this was really in aim of enhancing speed of execution, because when an institution becomes big, like the World Bank and many other institutions have become, invariably your processes kind of slows down. And it will also hit the New Development Bank, I'm sure, in 10, 15 years when it's a much, much bigger institution. But when you are small, you can be lean, you can be agile, you can do things quickly, right? So I'll give you a simple example. We, in a very short space of time, after about 6-7 months of operation, we were able to approve our first loans for $1.5 billion in about March 2016. Today, we have a loan book from a zero start in July 2015. We have a total loan book of $21 billion. Now, I think AIB, Joachim will mention the numbers later, is roughly around the same area. The significant aspect of this number, Rogerio, is the fact that some of the established institutions, in terms of their annual lending, is also around 10, 12, 15 billion. Our equilibrium, steady state annual lending now will be around $10 billion. It will be $10 billion this year. So let's take Brazil as a reference. Brazil will this year have just north of $2 billion in financial assistance or loans from the New Development Bank to Brazil. So we are already quite a significant provider of external finance for Brazil, although we are quite a newcomer. The second key aspect of the bank's foundations is our green credentials. We wanted to deepen the green and sustainable focus. We do not touch coal at all. It's not codified in policy yet, but all of our energy portfolio is 100% green. It's hydro, it's offshore wind, it's solar. There's not a touch of coal in there. The third aspect is around cloud-based technology. We do not have any, servers on all of our technology platforms and infrastructures in the cloud, whether it's our HR system, it's our treasury management system, our loan management system. So during COVID, we could function quite seamlessly in a remote fashion without having any disruptions of any kind. And then the fourth area of key feature is our emphasis on local currency financing. We want to make sure that our countries are able to have a more sustainable debt path, because as you know, emerging markets have over many decades have faced this situation where, having borrowed in US dollars, what seemed to be low interest rates, and then because of the depreciation of your own currency, your debt would spiral. And also, as you know, also most infrastructure projects have local revenues. So if you build any of a local project, really, the revenues are typically, whether it's electricity, it's all in local currency. And if your debt is in a hard currency, there's a mismatch there. So we want to provide more local currency financing. We have already issued, for example, in China, $13 billion of renminbi bonds. We have just registered a new program for 20 billion renminbi of bonds, and we are planning to do the same in the other BRICS countries. I want to just then highlight, in the interest of time, because I probably have 2 minutes left or so, talk about what I see as some of the key elements of what holds for the future of multilateral banks. The first one is moving away from the single product of country lending to governments. In the past, in 1947, when the World Bank made its first loan to France, a massive, in fact, it's probably still the biggest loan that was done in the multilateral banking system. That model of a country-based loan has defined multilateral banks ever since. And as you highlighted early on, the problems we face today are cross-national, right? They are global in character. So whether it's the fight for gender equality, whether it's climate change, whether it is cybersecurity, and the list goes on and on, biodiversity, all of these challenges are they cross borders, they're multi-jurisdictional. So the idea of a country loan is not the appropriate model going forward. We have to we have to implement development solutions rather than country loans. The second aspect is we need to be more catalytic, meaning we should use our capital in a sparing way, because it's taxpayer dollars, to be able to crowd in additional funding from the private sector, and that's called mobilization of private sector capital, and that is going to become a much bigger focus of multilateral banks' activities into the future. The third aspect I would just touch on is this idea of recycling capital more. I used to work in investment banks before, where it is pretty common, whether it's securitization products, the idea of sitting with loans on your books up to maturity is something that is really alien, because there are different investors out there with particular risk profiles. I'll give you a small example. If you build a port, for example, right? Once you start the project, it is very risky. There's construction risk, there's project delays, there's possible regulatory changes, all kinds of risk. Once that port is functional, you could on-sell that to many private investors who will like the return profile of that particular project. So the idea of recycling capital more and then using when the money comes back, using it for new development purposes is something that will become standard in the future. The fourth area I would say is more standard setting, meaning our role will become more one of setting the standards for the industry. So we shouldn't be measured on us having issued X number of green bonds, but we should behave in such a way that we can shape the entire market to behave in a particular way. So if we can green the whole of the financial system in Brazil, not just BNDES issuing green bonds, but BNDES using its power to shape market outcomes throughout the banking system in Brazil. And then finally, I would argue that we also now need to challenge some of the existing established wisdoms, for example, around the way these banks are rated. Now, this end on this. At the moment, all of our multilateral banks are very highly rated. We have a AA+ international credit rating, and that, by the way, is very significant in the context that Brazil is sub-investment grade, South Africa is sub-investment grade, and yet the bank was able to obtain a very high credit rating. The benefit of that, obviously, is the fact that we can raise capital in international debt markets at very low rates because of our high credit worthiness, and then pass on those low rates to Brazil, to South Africa, to India, and so on. The way these frameworks are set by external credit rating agencies imposes some restrictions on our ability to function. It makes us very risk averse. I think we have to look at some of those fundamentals and begin to relook at the ways in which we can design a structure that is more appropriate for our country's level of economic development. I hope I didn't go over the time, but thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, thank you, Leslie. That was an extraordinary start, and now let me pass it right away to Joaquin for his initial thoughts.
Thank you very much, Rogério, and really nice to see good colleagues and friends. Good morning to Brazil and good evening to colleagues in China. I can't help but mention that actually this week is a very special week for Brazil in AIB. As I'm sure you're aware, Brazil was one of our founding members, 57 founding members. But finally, a few days ago, Brazil completed its membership ratification and all the requirements for membership. So yesterday, Brazil's ambassador to China came to our office and we raised the Brazilian flag in our lobby. So now Brazil is a full member of AIB, and we're very proud of that and very happy. So I can't help but mention that as a happy prelude to my comments on the topic that is on the agenda. So what's the role of multilateralism? And I can resonate a lot with comments Leslie made, and will express some of them in different terms. In other areas, just subscribe to comments Leslie made. I mean, the role of multilateralism, and I refer particularly to multilateral development banks as a segment of multilateral institution that is kind of the focus of my comments. And I think will depend on the need for them, their ability to meet the needs, and then the willingness of members to use them. The need is obvious. I mean, the world is getting more connected, getting more crowded in many ways, whether through economic activities or impact on the environment, or now the virus or trade or financial interlinkages. So the need for collective action in different areas is clearly rising. And COVID is just another most dramatic reminder of that, as is climate change. So I think very little needs to be said about the need for multilateral actors. Then the question is, can multilateral development banks respond to that need? And I will talk more about that, because I think that's at the heart of sort of institutional reforms of the multilateral system. And both the need and the ability of multilaterals to respond to the need will then drive the members, the countries of the world's willingness to engage and use multilateral institutions for solving their problems. So let me focus really on the ability of multilateral institutions to address common challenges. And I think sort of the core of my comments really is that there are three fundamental characteristics of multilateral development banks that make them uniquely capable of acting effectively in the common interest of the global community. And yet in all three areas, obstacles have emerged, and they have in some ways been the motivation for creating new institutions such as the NDB and the AIB, but are also in some ways driving reforms in the existing institutions. And those three areas are governance, finance, and the business model, as I would call it. So first, the governance. I mean, the governance model of countries coming together, putting up capital, and forming what is in a sense a political oversight where countries are represented and jointly negotiate strategies, directions for the institution, but then having a technical professional management that runs a bank according to banking principles and following the high-level guidance of that political board. I think that model has proven incredibly powerful. You have, I think, countries that bilaterally suffer severe stresses work often quite constructively together in the boards of these institutions. I mean, if you just think of in our board, the 5 largest shareholders are China, India, Russia, Germany, Korea. Multiple complex relations, and if you add the other 97 members, it gets, of course, more complicated. But just the fact that these large countries with very different interests work constructively together is an incredible achievement. And then that beneath them, they have a professional machine and management that actually implements directions in a professional, reasonably efficient way. I think it's an incredibly powerful model. So governance is a really key element, but it is creaking. It is creaking because it has been very difficult to adjust the composition of, in particular, representation of countries to the changing world. And clearly, one of the motivations for founding new institutions has been the difficulty of adjusting voting powers, shares in existing institutions. And it seemed to, and it turned out to be easier to create new institutions with representation and shareholderships that reflect the economies of 2015 than to adjust existing institutions. Now, how that will look in 50 years is a different question, because of course we as new institutions will be subject to the same changes in the world. We don't know which ones. So the issue will reoccur if we don't find ways of continuously adjusting shareholdership. The other tweak that in our case we have brought to the governance is to increase the, I think, clarity of responsibilities between the political board and the professional management. And that's expressed in a non-resident board and a clearer delegation of authorities from the board to management, for example, on approval of routine projects. So we've tried to, I think, enhance the existing model by clarifying further the separate powers of the political board from the professional management. So that's the story on governance. On finance, I think Leslie already made some really good comments. The basic model of the MDBs is absolutely compelling. Countries get together, create a balance sheet with rather modest cash contributions of capital, a balance sheet that then gets a high credit rating that allows the members to borrow at a much lower cost than if they borrow directly in the markets. And that's the model that is underpinning the MDBs, and that remains highly relevant, highly efficient in terms of investments generated for fiscal outlays, which is ultimately the capital that has initially been put into these institutions. And I think we are built on the same model because it's so successful. And where it's broken down, or where I think it needs enhancement, is one, because of the governance issue, it has been difficult to grow the balance sheets of the system. And so again, because it has been difficult to adjust, give, in a sense, voting powers to those countries willing to put up more capital, it has been easier to create new balance sheets with new distribution and more shares for those who want to put up new capital than to grow the balance sheet of existing institutions. That's, I think, has been one challenge. The other challenge, and Leslie talked about that, is that today, on-balance sheet activities, even of their own MDBs, will be minute compared to the needs of financing in the market we're in. So the big game is no longer about the balance sheet size. It is about how to use the balance sheet to mobilize off-balance sheet resources. And Leslie has mentioned several examples of how we mobilize, how how we leverage our balance sheet, in particular through operations through non-sovereign private sector clients. And that's been at the core of our business model from the beginning. So that's the finance side. And then thirdly, the business model. So again, the basic business model of the MDBs of combining financing with technical advice and what I would call honest broker role has been incredibly powerful. Financing has been the carrier of technical assistance, advice, and I think that model, when an MDB acts as an honest, trusted party, has been very, very powerful to support policy reform, support a much bigger impact for development results than the actual amount that MDBs finance as a share of either total investment or public investment would suggest. And yet, also that model faces challenges. I think that combination of finance and advice has created a risk of overbearing external influence on countries and has created resentment, in particular in countries with weaker institutions that don't have the institutional capacity to differentiate advice that the country generally wants to take versus advice it is in some ways compelled to take because of relatively low-cost financing. And I think that that overbearing nature that comes in particular with concessional finance, I think has been a risk and a limitation to what is in principle a very, very compelling business model. So that's the third area for innovation, where I have the least of a recipe or least clarity about how to overcome that problem, other than saying, I think similar to Leslie again, because we as young institutions are lean and actually have very limited technical capacity on our own, we have very little risk of being overbearing on clients, and therefore sort of offer an opportunity for a model that encourages, I think, genuine country ownership in a sense naturally. But it's a little more by default of our young, lean nature. And I think we are still very much working on what does it actually mean in the long term to build our capacity to support, but at the same time, I mean, learn the lessons of how to build institutions and how to not be an overbearing partner to a country. So that's sort of the three areas, governance, finance, and business model I want to highlight as the three beautiful fundamental features of MDBs, but also three areas for reform that have inspired, I think, the founders of new banks like the NDB and certainly ourselves. Just a few words about ourselves. I mean, China initiated AIB, 57 countries joined. We opened our doors in 2016. We have now grown from 57 founding members to 103 members. And I think that has been the result of trust in the governance. So trust in our embracing the true multilateral governance, firmly legally established with rights of members, very clearly legally enshrined in our documents and operations. On the finance side, we have been able to get the AAA rating from international rating agencies in 2017, and therefore have sort of shown that we are in the sort of group of established MDBs, have similar low funding costs, and are very keen to maintain that. And then on the operations side, yeah, our numbers look again quite similar to the NDB, even though the portfolio quite different because it's spread over a much larger number of members. We have made some 100+ financing commitments for $22 billion in the 5 years of our existence, but 10 billion of that in this year. So the COVID crisis really has accelerated our financial operations quite dramatically. And we now have a clear strategy of financing infrastructure for tomorrow, focused on sustainable green infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure, technology enhanced infrastructure, and private capital mobilization. So on the sort of crisis and the way forward, I think that this crisis again, and I think that echoes Rogerio's opening comments, has given a boost to multilateral cooperation. I think from the start of this crisis, It has intensified the debates and the engagement between the MDBs and given a big push forward to what the eminent person groups under Tarman a couple of years ago asked for, which is operating the MDBs as a system with joint shareholders. And I think the crisis has moved us a big step forward toward that. We have co-financed a lot with the World Bank and the ADB, also EBRD and IFC in this crisis, much more than in the preceding years, and because coordinated action makes much more sense. And we were financing in areas where we didn't have much technical expertise. So in sum, because we are lean and very modest still in terms of our staffing and own capacity, we are naturally inclined to partner. So naturally inclined to co-finance, look for others who have capacities we don't have and complement them where we have something to offer, rather than sort of become a everything for everyone additional institution, and certainly one that will not compete but collaborate with the existing players, simply because of the of our own limitations and the need of the shareholders for that collaboration. And then lastly, on China as our largest shareholder, I mean, like other countries engaged in development, China has chosen multiple paths for its own financial development strategy and invests in bilateral as well as multilateral channels. We hope and expect that the, I think so far quite a successful experience of AIB also encourages China as our largest shareholder to increase overall its engagement for multilateral channels, because it has shown to be effective. And I think the existence of AIB proves that sort of the principle of multilateral cooperation, the principle of multilateral development banks is robust to changing powers, changing economic weights in the world. And the fact that China has chosen to initiate a bank that then has adopted a basic finance, governance, and business model that is quite firmly built on the existing model, I think is a very strong endorsement and shows, I think, the resilience of that basic model while underlying the need for reforms and continuous evolution of the system. Thank you.
That was certainly an incredible follow-up from the previous speaker. And let me ask Karim to give a scholar's view on the issue. And I have to, I should have mentioned that before, but because of previous professional engagements, I would have to leave the session with feeling really sorry about this, because it's really a rich conversation. And I'll pass the floor to my co-coordinator, Cynthia. Karim, please have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to thank CEBRI for inviting me to speak today, and especially special thanks to Rogério and Tatiana. And to answer the question, how are the multilateral development banks shaping multilateralism going forward? I have three messages today. And the first one is that the NGB and the AIIB, they offer two new models of development finance that are inspired by an Asian approach to cooperation, and that largely complements the work of traditional NGBs. And one of these models is the local approach that the NGB has taken, that emphasizes partnerships with national financial institutions, as well as the use of country systems and the purchase of goods and the recruitment of staff from within its member countries. And on the other side, it's the model that it's been adopted by the AIIB, that it's largely international focused, prioritizes co-financing with established MGBs, and applies standards directly. And it's also open to the purchase of goods and recruitment of staff from across the world. There are three aspects, I believe, that are crucial for us to understand not only how these two new banks distinguish one from another, but also how they set, what sets them apart from traditional MGBs. And here I'll do my best not to repeat what Leslie and Joaquin already mentioned. But the first one is how the AIIB and the NGB are governed. And we often hear that the NGB is led by the BRICS countries, which is true. But equally, or even more important, to my view, is the fact that the NDB is a borrowing country-led bank and led by and targeted at emerging and developing countries. And I think this is really important to note. And in the case of the AIIB, Asian countries, they also must hold the vast majority of the total subscribed capital stock. But since most of these countries are emerging or developing countries, it would be fair to argue that the AIIB, like the NGB, would also be led by emerging and developing countries. And this is a major difference from traditional MDBs and what they and what has inspired the creation of these two new banks back in 2015. The second difference is the emphasis that the NGB has put in equal decision-making by distributing the initial subscribed capital and voting power amongst the 5 BRICS countries in an even way. And in the case of the AIIB, it's different. Each member voting power is tied to the number of shares that they hold, meaning that the AIIB is dominated by the countries who contribute the largest amount, which is very much similar to the model that has been taken by traditional MDBs. But I think a point here that I would like to make is that given the fact that China and India, two Asian giants, are by far the largest shareholders of the AIIB, we could say that the AIIB would stand perhaps closer to the NDB in terms of emerging and developing countries having a greater say also in the bank's decision-making process. Third is that both the AIIB and the NDB, they follow an Asian approach to development cooperation. And what do I mean by an Asian approach to development cooperation? Essentially, it's an approach that relies on infrastructure lending to increase domestic and interregional connectivity and competitiveness, with a lot of emphasis on trade and investments for economic growth. And this approach has been promoted by China as well as India based on their own national development experiences, and builds to a large extent on these two countries' definitions of cooperation that combine aid on the one side with trade and investments to promote structural transformations. And this largely contrasts from my perspective with the route that has been taken by traditional MDBs, and which have prioritized, and especially in more recent years, institutional reforms in borrowing countries. My second message is that infrastructure lending and sustainable development, they must meet each other beyond the discourse level. And this is particularly true if the AIIB and the NGB are to realize their mandates in line with the international regime that gave birth to them in first place. And in my view, this is an inclusion, it is precisely the inclusion of sustainable development in the mandate of these two banks side by side with infrastructure that truly distinguishes them from other multilateral development banks. And I think it's very easy to understand why it's so, as these two new banks were created on the same year as the 2030 Development Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda and the Paris Agreement were adopted. But the strategies to achieve this goal between both the NGB and the AIIB, they seem fairly similar, with the two banks focusing on investments on clean energy and other infrastructure projects to increase domestic and interregional connectivity and competitiveness. But while the intentions are clear, it's not until the development results by these two banks are assessed that their real contribution can be verified. And in the case of the NGB, the 5-year strategy states that 2/3 of the bank's portfolio should be allocated to the financing of sustainable infrastructure projects. In the case of the AIIB, there is no such provision or general goals for portfolio allocation in sustainable infrastructure, but in a way, this is compensated by the bank's actual strategies, which provide conditions for the projects to pursue the idea of transformation. And here, I think it's really important to stress this word, a transformation, which means that the AIIB and the NGB, they can go beyond avoiding, mitigating, and compensating adverse impacts of their projects on the environment and vulnerable groups. And this approach has been tried by traditional MGBs, especially through the use of safeguards, and has proven limited in a way as it does not necessarily unlock the transformational nature of development itself. And the NGB and the AIIB, they can go beyond what I call this do no harm approach to more consciously generate additional positive impacts on the environment, the societies, and the economies in the borrowing countries. But as I mentioned earlier, the AIIB and the AIIB, they still have to offer a definition for sustainable infrastructure that can be measured and verified. And my third and last message is that all these MGBs, both new development banks as well as traditional multilateral development banks, they can go beyond their role as financiers. And I think this has already been pointed very nicely by Joaquin. And especially to help member countries not only to recover from the pandemic and the socioeconomic crisis that has resulted from the pandemic, but also adapt to and benefit from an increasingly transforming role that has Asia in its epicenter. And here I would like to highlight the fact that some of the major global transformations today, such as the transition to the Industry 4.0, and the digital economy comes from Asia, and I myself have lived in Asia for the past 5-6 years, in India and now China, and I can testify firsthand some of these transformations happening, and even domestic policies that are being taken by some of these countries will also have an impact beyond their borders. And for example, China's commitment to become a carbon neutral economy by 2060 is very likely to trickle down to its global value chains and push countries to adapt, but also offer opportunities for those countries who are able to adapt. And I think here it's really important for the MGBs to point this north by supporting studies that impact the likely impact of these transformations, by promoting dialogues to help member countries assimilate these impacts into their development strategies, and also helping countries or working with countries to design programs that prepare them for the future. And the two banks, and now I talk specifically about the NGB and the AIIB, they can also set clear expectations for the transition to a more sustainable and inclusive economy, by inducing economic agents to anticipate some of these trends and increase the quality of their investments. And one way that this could be done is, for instance, by giving longer terms for maturity of their loans, or lower interest rates for projects that are more closely in line with the idea of sustainable development. And this is something that MGBs are not doing yet. I've seen commercial banks in Brazil doing it already. So are they leading the way? My final remark is that the potential of the AIIB and the NGB, they cannot be realized without close collaboration with knowledge networks. And here I do not refer just to academia and think tanks. We are in a think tank right now, but also a wide range of actors, including other MGBs, UN agencies, private sector, and civil society. And these actors, they can certainly offer experiences and ideas to support the operations of these two new banks, in addition to development policy. And finally, traditional MGBs, like the World Bank, through its former World Bank Institute, which years ago was integrated into the Knowledge and Learning Vice Presidency, and even the Asian Development Bank Institute and the United Nations could share some experiences of what has worked and what has not worked in their own trajectories. And these networks will be particularly relevant if the two new banks are to remain a lean organization and offer development solutions in an agile and meaningful way. And as Leslie has already pointed, solutions whenever these development solutions are. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Karim, for another rich, precise, and very concise presentation. I'm taking notes for what you're saying, but all saying, and also want to leave some further questions to my co-moderator. With that, let me pass the floor to Martin, representing here the more seasoned sister institution, to give his views on the issues that we framed in the beginning of this webinar. Martin, it's with you.
Thanks a lot, Rogério, and good to see old friends in Brazil. Muitas saudades, if I may say so, and I hope soon we'll be able to see each other in person as well. I know we're running a little bit over, so I think I'm not going to speak for very long because a lot of things have been said. The first thing, let me start with the things that I agree with, and then just to make it interesting, raise a few questions where I think the issues are not so clear-cut. So I agree with the fact that in development finance today, all of us collectively are playing a very marginal role in financial terms. And the only way that we can hope to sustainably achieve the development goals, or indeed help many countries achieve their development potential through development finance, is by achieving greater leverage. Just to give you some numbers, official development assistance, which is the concessional part of development finance from bilateral creditors as well as multilateral development banks, is around $100 billion a year. FDI is $800 billion a year. Remittances is $500 billion a year. Private debt markets are around $500 billion a year. So clearly, the role of ODA is quite marginal. We, I think, said in the World Bank that we need to find ways to turn billions into trillions. And I think that agenda still remains relevant. And to be honest, we talk a lot about it, but it's very true. I think one of the things that we've learned in the World Bank is that it sounds great, but it's actually not so easy to find ways for us to truly leverage private capital for development. And one of the reasons for that is, and that maybe links to one of the questions that I have, which I'll keep for later, one of the reasons for that links to the fact that private investors don't like to lose money. And they tend to lose money when institutional conditions, regulatory frameworks, etc., are weak. And the amount of risk insurance that they need to buy to feel encouraged to go in tends to be quite large. And when the leverage turns into the public sector assuming all of the risk and the private sector just collecting the premium, then obviously we haven't achieved our goal. So how we transfer the risks that the private sector can handle effectively to the private sector whilst providing the kind of guarantees and assurances that will make that possible through public sector institutions and the MDBs, I think remains very much an open question. We've got good examples, but I don't think we're nearly as far advanced as we wish to be. The second thing with which I would agree on a personal level, although as a World Bank staff, this is really not up to me to comment, but is the fact that the changes in the global in the global distribution of income, if you will, across countries, naturally should lead to changes in the governance of the multilateral financial system. And if the solution is, instead of changing voting shares in one institution, to create additional institutions, I think we would welcome that. We have seen in the 5 years of existence of AIIB and the NDB, excellent collaboration between our institutions. The presidents meet on a regular basis. We do quite a lot of co-financing. And quite frankly, sometimes a little bit of competition is not a bad thing. If AIIB and NDB can be nimbler and as a result encourage the World Bank to review some of its internal processes to see whether we can't be as nimble and as quick, I think that's a good thing. And I think the response that the World Bank had in the context of the COVID crisis shows that we are able to react to the challenge. We will be dispersing or committing hopefully up to $160 billion in 15 months. That's a major effort in an environment in which people can't travel to the countries, in which our usual processes really have to be rethought. And I think, we would be doing this for our clients anyway. The fact that we have other players that demonstrate how things can be done nimbler, I think is a good thing. Now, I think the suggestion that came through between the lines is a little bit that the traditional development model has shown its limitations, and therefore innovation can only come from the new players. I would take issue with that. I think the World Bank has done quite a lot of innovation, both of its balance sheet, as Joachim knows quite well, the way IDA has imaginatively used its balance sheet to leverage up is a good example. And I think some of the things that Leslie has suggested, such as selling down portfolio to achieve more, to achieve faster turnover of capital, were certainly things that are actively discussed inside the World Bank. I don't think any of us have yet done this on a large scale. We've had some asset swaps or some portfolio swaps across institutions to create additional capital, but it's clearly not the case that the World Bank doesn't think about these issues and the new players do. So I think we all need to think about them. I think we also are all quite, Karen mentioned the importance for us to achieve sustainability, to demonstrate climate action. The World Bank at its annual meetings in Lima made, as the first multilateral development institution, a firm commitment about the amount of resources that it would allocate to climate action. That target has been, at the time, was set at 30% and has been superseded since. And so it does show that that this is possible, even in the more established institutions. And I think we all need to learn together how we can demonstrate how traditional development finance for infrastructure, et cetera, can be combined with climate action. Indeed, a lot of what we're learning about infrastructure is and climate is that you need to think about the life cycle of the assets. And what looks like a reasonable investment today from a climate perspective, particularly if you take into account uncertainty, may not be such a good investment in the long run. And so trying to incorporate climate resilience, trying to incorporate longer term climate impacts in our assessment of the viability of projects, I think remains a very important challenge. Now, let me say an area where I believe our model is not broken, although I welcome the discussion, is on the need to have solid analysis in helping define the priorities and setting the right strategy. I'm happy about the fact that we have had support from our board for continuing to invest in the knowledge. I don't think that should be an investment that's driven by priors. It should be based on evidence. But I think is the Nobel Prize for Economics awarded to Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee and Michael Kramer last year suggests that evidence often points in very different directions, and understanding development in that way deeply, I think is important for us to achieve lasting impact. And so I do think it's a good thing that we have a heavy knowledge function. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it is also important that we are honest with our clients about where we think their long-term, where we see their long-term opportunities are. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have to agree with us, and that is not the same thing as setting up conditionality. But a good and robust policy discussion and dialogue, I think, is a very important contribution to development. Let me quote from my own experience in Brazil. Brazil, when I was there, was going through a major fiscal adjustment. There was very limited borrowing room. My predecessors had provided substantial financing to Brazil, but while I was there, that wasn't the major need. And I remember one of my counterparts in the government saying, look, you've been a great country director. You've spent no money for the World Bank, but you've had major impact. I don't think that's a bad outcome. I don't think development impact always comes from being the largest source of financing, despite of what I said at the beginning. I think you need both. And so let me conclude with a final point on the basis for our cooperation going forward. I think the basis for our cooperation has to be a joint understanding of the importance of strong analytics, of good commercial viability assessments or good economic feasibility assessments, strong standards of transparency, and strong standards of environmental and social safeguards. And I think these are things that are rooted in 75 years of experience. And even though they're complicated sometimes, even though they sometimes take a little bit of extra time, cutting corners on economic feasibility analysis, on environmental sustainability analysis, on the need to consult the beneficiaries of the projects to see how they look at things. These are experiences that I think have been proven over time to be worthy of preservation and extension. There can be rightful discussions about the risks of handling these exercises in a more compliance orientation rather than with a view to really achieving lasting development impact. But I think these are things that we have learned and where we are very happy in the collaboration with, for instance, the AIIB, that we stand on very similar grounds, and as the Equator Principles that increasingly commercial banks are also adopting demonstrate, I think there is global consensus that there is a sustainable way of doing development finance that is worthy of being nurtured. So on that front, I think we certainly welcome additional discussion, and we certainly welcome continued partnership, including, and maybe that will be my final word, from the new bilateral development financing partners, of which there has been plenty of discussion, and with whom we now find ourselves in several countries as joint creditors in a situation in which these countries are facing severe debt difficulties. And so naturally, we have significant needs for collaboration, for coordination with these new development financing partners. And I think the principles of that coordination, once again, should be transparency, a commitment to sound analysis, and to strong social and environmental safeguards. And on that basis, I do believe, in some ways, the more the merrier. Development needs are still very large. We welcome the addition of new players that keep us on our toes, keep us innovating, and keep us efficient. And with that, thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective.
Thank you very much for another very rich, precise, and concise presentation, which thus far has been a very, very interesting discussion. And I really like that. I have to say, Martin, that I can testify to the capacity of the World Bank to continue to rejuvenate and be innovative. And Joaquin too would say that. And this is what is important: the capacity of attracting human capital such as you, and constantly renovating according to the challenge that the world is facing, is what makes an institution young. And certainly the World Bank is very, very young in that sense. As I said, this discussion has been so rich that makes me really regret to have to leave now. As a matter of fact, I'm 15 minutes late to my other commitment, but I'm going to leave the moderation to the very capable hands of Cynthia. We have prepared some additional questions for you, listening to what you had to say, but also we have to give the opportunity to those listening to us to present their questions. And I look forward to listening to the recording of that. Once again, thank you very, very much, and I hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you,
Cynthia,
Rogério.
with you.
If I may, Cynthia, start with a comment I was very, very glad to hear what Leslie raised, and then it was followed by comments by Joaquin and Martin and Karen, which was the tradition of country loans that comes from, of course, historical circumstances after the war. But now I believe that it's time to part ways with this strict rule of country loans and go with non-sovereign loans. As a matter of fact, about 3 months ago, we had a meeting with Vice President Mourão, and Tatiana participated. And this was one of the issues that we raised regarding finance, which was to encourage the co-financing of multilateral development banks, such as New Development Bank, AIIB, and the World Bank, with BNDES, and also regional banks like BDMG. The chairman of BDMG is participating here with us, Sergio. I believe this is a gain-gain situation. I remember when at BNDES, we decided, we were making the decision to participate in capital markets operations, and not related to a specific investment, which was the tradition of BNDES. And at that time, we decided that we would participate in capital markets operation, equity issues, debentures, together with other banks like Bradesco, Itaú, Santander, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs. We would take something like 30% of the deal and have the rest of the private and investment, private banks, investment banks, and other banks take the rest. And this was very good because it helped in terms of the risk analysis of the several deals, avoided mistakes, and leveraged the potential of the funds that we had. In the case of the New Development Bank, $2 billion, Leslie, is a wonderful amount, but imagine that if that were 20% of what you could finance together with AIIB, BNDES, the World Bank, and other banks. That would have an immense effect in financing new projects in Brazil. So I think this is Joaquin also mentioned that the idea of co-financing. I think your director in São Paulo, Leslie Claudia, former director of BNDES, is very well aware of that. And I think that's the right way to go. The second comment that I have regarding financing is the currency risk. I think coming from you being basically banks with a large participation of Asian countries, and Brazil having now almost 50% of the trade directed to Asia. One way to avoid this discussion of the currency risk is obviously to finance infrastructure directed to exports. As if you're financing railroads or storage related to soy or to pulp and paper or to oil, anything that is directed to exports, it avoids you're leveraged, you are hedged by the country, by the receipts in renminbi or dollars. So there is no currency risk of devaluation and creating trouble along the way. So Thank you very much all for participating. I pass it to Cynthia for other questions.
Thank you, Pio. Good morning and good evening to those watching us from Asia. Again, it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I would now like to ask a round of questions to the panelists to start our conversation this morning. And I'd like to go to Leslie first, if you don't mind to call you by your first names. So Leslie, the NDB was born out of 3 innovative platforms for multilateralism. 1, South-to-South cooperation. 2, a mandate anchored on sustainability and strongly geared towards sustainable infrastructure. And 3, close cooperation with national public institutions. A good example is the 1.2 billion BNDES NDB Sustainable Infrastructure Project. This project was proposed to address these challenges and to support the government of Brazil's efforts in infrastructure development through NDB's support to BNDES, which is the main financial agent for development through finance in Brazil. This project also aims to contribute to BNDES's ongoing efforts in mobilizing and coordinating public and private resources. Could you please talk a little bit about the project and what it represents in NDB's strategy in Brazil?
Thank you very much for that question, Cynthia. I'll just make a few introductory comments about the strategic approach we are taking in terms of our relationships with institutions like BNDES in Brazil. 1 or 2 comments about infrastructure, financing and the deficit in Brazil, and then a specific comment around the project which you've just inquired about. The first point to make, which I think all of our listeners would be aware of, and that is that increasing infrastructure investment in Brazil is a huge strategic priority for the country. As we know, infrastructure investment over the past 2 decades have lagged in Brazil at maybe around 2% of GDP. And Cynthia, just to give you a bit of a perspective, comparators of other BRICS members in China, that number around investment is around 7% of GDP. In India, around 5.5% of GDP. The World Bank estimates that Brazil needs to invest at least 3.3% of its GDP to replace depreciated infrastructure stock and to build new infrastructure. So BNDES therefore becomes a new development bank, and other multilateral banks become very critical as instruments to complement and support the government's effort to meet these objectives. With respect to our relationship with BNDES, we identified way back in 2015 a strategy to work very closely with national development banks in our member countries. National development banks are very critical and often appreciated in terms of the critical role that they play. They have local knowledge and local origination capacity, deep knowledge about the local market. They have obviously strong access to local currency markets. They've got good traction with the investor base, and the list goes on and on. The most important thing is that they've got deep local know-how. So we set up a strategy to work with national financial intermediaries, and BNDES is obviously the key one for us in Brazil. So this loan that you made reference to, $1.2 billion, has been specifically earmarked during this as part of our emergency assistance program for the COVID response. And what's unique about this, firstly, it's a partnership with BNDES. We're providing $1.2 billion, and BNDES itself is providing $300 million. So in total, it's a $1.5 billion facility, if you like, which BNDES effectively will manage. They then, in turn, will on-lend that to various private sector and various sub-projects, which I will speak about in a second. So what we've done is define the eligible sectors. And again, we have set certain criteria under that eligible sectors, for example, renewable energy. So again, continuing with the green theme, transport and logistics is another eligible sector, water and sanitation, urban mobility, social infrastructure, as well as ICT. The final point I'd like to make is that there are two very critical criteria that BNDES will apply in the selection of these projects. One is innovation. As you know, we're living in an era where you can have so much multiply effect in terms of development if you can add and look at the potential of new technology. So they will identify the scope for innovation as they select projects under each of those category. And then the final one is obviously development impact. Every project goes through rigorous analysis ex ante, meaning we decide up front before we make the investment, what will be the size and scope of the development impact. So development impact then is a very critical set of metrics where they are not just measured, but they will then later on be monitored once the projects are in operation. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. That was a great response. I'd like now to pose a question to Joachim. Like the NDB, the AIIB was created with a mandate to scale up financing for sustainable development. Its focus was initially sustainable infrastructure in Asia. More recently, it has begun expanding its mandate to address its partners' immediate health and financing crisis. And it is now expanding geographically towards other regions, such as Latin America, as the recent support to Ecuador indicates. Could you please share with us AIIB's strategy to help address the significant global challenges we have in front of us? And what are its plans for Latin America? Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I mean, we have quite a deliberate strategy of how we sort of build an organization that is still very modest in face of a huge finance needs and development challenge. I think we very deliberately started with a very clear focus and are gradually expanding on different dimensions. Let me explain. So our core focus is really hard infrastructure investments, project finance in our Asian members, power, transport, water, urban, project finance. That's sort of the base from which we're starting. As we're building experience, as we're gaining capacity, as we're gaining credibility in the market, we are gradually expanding in 3 dimensions to apply that capacity and capability, but still at a very modest scale. I joined AIB as staff number 27. Today we are 350. So if you compare that to our peers like the World Bank with staff in the high thousands, it's just no comparison in terms of what we can deliver, in particular on knowledge services to the clients. I mean, it's just no comparison, and will not be, because our business model is one that remains much tighter, and that has advantages, but also implies weaknesses and lack of certain capacities. But the 3 dimensions on which we are gradually expanding is first geography. We have the ability to invest in our non-regional members. That means non-Asian members, and that of course includes European, African, and Latin American members. And we have just, as you mentioned a few weeks ago, approved the first financing in Ecuador, which was the first financing in Latin America. That will remain a modest part of our activities, but it has a clear focus on financing projects or investments that are linked to Asia. We will be focused, because we have done nothing other than the Ecuador project. We will be focused on investments in trade infrastructure. So it could be ports or railways to ports, certainly digital infrastructure that connects continents, and climate mitigation, because climate mitigation anywhere in the world benefits Asia as it does benefit the rest of the world. So these are the focus areas for our investments in non-regional members, and that of course applies to Brazil, Brazil having now completed its membership requirements, we can now invest in Brazil and are keen to explore opportunities in this space, whether it's renewable energy or trade infrastructure in particular. The second dimension is sectorally. So our mandate is to invest in infrastructure and other productive sectors. So starting from the hardcore infrastructure, we are growing into related areas. And I think partly as a result of the COVID crisis, health infrastructure has emerged as an area of expansion for us, where we will gradually build capabilities. Of course, we work with partners who have more experience in this area, but we see just many countries alerted through COVID to the broader weaknesses in their health infrastructure that we see an important role there. And then the third expansion is on the project cycle, where we have started just, in a sense, writing additional checks to projects that others have prepared. We seek to increasingly help partners prepare good projects and also implement projects well under international standards. And then in the end, recycle assets. Leslie referred to that dimension earlier. But that links, that sort of gradual expansion of our role in the project cycle requires a lot more capacity. So we're quite cautious there. And I want to connect to Martin's comment there, because I mean, the World Bank has an unmatched capacity to provide knowledge and advice that becomes more important as you sort of complete your role from project finance to project preparation, and then the policy environment in which projects are viable or not viable. So policy advice then becomes very much linked, and the World Bank has an incredible, I think, impact because of the leverage that comes through policy advice, rather than simply financing. And that is not something we will do in the foreseeable future, but we are very keenly co-financing with the World Bank often, exactly because that assures us that there is adequate analysis and policy advice provided in the context in which we are financing, which first of all makes projects more viable, and secondly ensures benefits to the country from the investments made. So I just want to sort of emphasize that complementarity.
Thank you, Joachim. And also thank you for bringing us the good news that Brazil's and is now an official member to AIIB. Finally, that's a great accomplishment that makes us proud. I now have a question for Karen. Hawaii tea, right? Your name in Chinese, right? Karen, in 2009, the great global crisis gave a boost in multilateralism, leading to both questioning the governance and business models of the existing institutions, and as well as the creation of new ones, as was already mentioned earlier by someone in previous remarks. The social economic impacts of the current crisis, unfortunately, make those of the previous crisis seem small. And the need to review multilateral cooperation has never been greater. Do you see any signs that the crisis will reshape multilateralism and the collaboration among multilateral institutions?
Thank you, Cynthia, and good pronunciation of my Chinese name. I second Pio and Leslie and others on the need for co-financing for development solutions. And I believe this was precisely the case of the COVID response in Brazil that pretty fast mobilized emergency resources from different MDBs in a relatively short amount of time. But on the other side, multilateralism has also failed in a way by stressing people more as the object of these initiatives than part of the solution. And let me give you an example. Today, small and medium enterprises are responsible for approximately more than 90% of all firms in Brazil, and approximately 25% of Brazilian GDP. And some of these MDBs, emergency relief packages to Brazil, have adequately, from my perspective, targeted the sector as part of a broader strategy to promote economic growth with social inclusion. But how many of these MGBs actually consider the different impact of the pandemic on male and female run SMEs when they designed these emergency relief packages? And this knowing that Brazilian women are the most affected by the crisis. How many of them have actually worked with these women or female-led SMEs to find adequate solutions for them? So to answer the question, I believe that this crisis will only reshape multilateralism and collaboration amongst the different multilateral international institutions when we are ready to truly reimagine development. And by reimagining development, I mean placing people at the center by renewing partnership with the private, and also by renewing the partnership with the private sector and regional and sub-regional MGBs. And these last 2 points, I think, are particularly important in the case of the NGB and to a certain degree also to the AIIB. Dialogue. So first, people, dialogue between these institutions and, as I already mentioned, academia, think tanks, civil society organizations, it must deepen in a way that brings value to both sides. And here I would like to cite a really positive example of the 2 dialogues that the New Development Bank hosted with civil society organizations back in 2017 and 18. And I truly believe that initiatives like this, they must continue and deepen, including through greater access to project information, joint initiatives to assess the lessons that are emerging from these different projects and, of course, their development impact. The second, the private sector, partnership with the private sector is also important in the case of, in our case in Brazil, given the reduced fiscal space for states to contract debt from organizations. And this partnership would also be important to inject more dynamism into intra-BRICS trade and investments. And here I'm talking about different geometries other than Brazil and China that on itself has a very thriving relationship in terms of trade and investments, but this is much less in the case of Brazil and India and others, and so the different geometries and combinations. And also, as we talk about global transformations, we cannot forget about the importance of investments in inter-regional connectivity and competitiveness to allow different regions and ourselves in Latin America to integrate into new global value chains and global value chains that are connecting with Asia more and more. And again, the AIIB and the NGB, I believe they will need to partner with regional and sub-regional MGBs, at least for the short term and medium term, perhaps to finance develop on a regional scale, at least until membership expansion is resolved in the case of the NGB, or new formal partnerships are forged with different countries.
Wonderful, thank you, Karen. Now I have a question for Martin. The World Bank continues to have an extraordinary impact and influence in shaping development views. However, given the size of the global challenges and the exceptional needs coming from its members' current health, social, and economic crisis, will it need to join forces with other development institutions? And could you please explain how you see this cooperation moving forward, particularly concerning the NDB and AIIB?
Thank you, Cynthia. I think the answer to that question is quite simple. I mean, there are great financial needs, urgent financial needs, and the MDBs are in a position to provide that financing at maturities and rates of interest that are commensurate with the very limited debt carrying capacity that a lot of these countries have. And so we all must work together to provide the additional liquidity support and long-term development financing that these countries need. And I think the COVID response has already shown that to a very significant degree. I do think in a number of countries, we now face the urgent challenge to deal with the problem of debt, simply because, never mind the amount of financing that we can put on the table, the existing debt that these countries have accumulated is beyond the capacity of the countries to repay. And so we must collectively find a solution to that problem. And that involves not just the multilateral institutions, that does involve the bilateral institutions, including from new development financing partners. And so I think that's in the short run of a major additional challenge that we all face. But to answer your question, I mean, we obviously are working very closely together with the ADB, with the AIIB here in Asia, with the NDB on the public health response. Several of us have provided emergency financing to support health sectors. Several of us are considering providing financing for the vaccine deployment. So this shows that at that level, I think we have collectively risen to the challenge of COVID-19, even though I also should say we should be humble enough to recognize that our resources are not nearly enough given the size of the challenges that the world faces.
Thank you. We do have some interesting questions from our audience, but before we go to those, I'd like to check if Tatiana, by any chance, would like to jump in or at a later moment. What do you think?
Thanks, Cynthia. Please, it has been really a privilege to be here. But please take the questions from the audience and then get to me if we have time.
Okay, that's great. And please feel free to jump in at any time if you wish, as well as Pio again, of course, in case you have any additional comments. So I'd like to try to throw two questions, a set of two questions, and then I'll open the floor to any of you who would like to comment on them, since we don't have that much more time left. We have a question from Chris Humphrey. What is the role of the MDBs during a crisis in liquidity provision? And a second question is from Gustavo Rojas. To what extent are the new non-Western inspired banks attracting new ways of assessing the risk of infrastructure loans? I'd like to leave it open. Would any of you like to comment on any or both of the questions? Please feel free to jump in.
I'll give a very brief comment on the first question from Chris Humphrey. Professor Humphrey, as you know, is himself a deep expert on multilaterals, and I wonder what his view would be on this question. But as we all know, the provision of liquidity is not really part of the core construct of the original rationale and the business model of multilateral development banks. As I said, the core products and instruments we provide is really the sort of sovereign loan that has since expanded into equities. We also provide guarantees. We do credit enhancement and so on. What Chris is referring to is we are in a unique, very deep external sort of distress shock situation induced by COVID, where the need for liquidity is central to the keeping businesses afloat and keeping a lot of countries from, for example, defaulting. So I guess what Chris is making reference to is that should one go back to the drawing boards and ask whether our responses are in line with what the situation demands. In terms of balance of payments, liquidity provision, that's more role that the IMF, as you know, typically plays. In a traditional sort of fiscal policy sense, the IMF has that more central role together with the World Bank, which provides budgetary support. Some of the MDBs, like New Development Bank, like AIIB, we do not provide budgetary support as part of our core mandate in terms of our articles. But I guess what I would really support the inference from what Chris is saying is that we have to take a fresh look at our toolkit at the toolbox as to what we do and whether these are appropriate for what the emergency crisis situation induced by COVID demands of us. Thank you.
If I may, maybe some quick reaction to the second question on sort of the risks of infrastructure and the, I think, Asian model, if I understood it correctly. I mean, I think anywhere infrastructure is complicated and physical. So it is risky. It is risky in terms of causing natural environmental damage. It's risky in terms of causing social damage. It is prone to corruption. So infrastructure has characteristics simply because it's so physical and so big that makes it risky in some ways. And that's also why it's so difficult. Why we have been created to focus on that particular set of sectors, because it's actually been hard for countries to build high quality infrastructure. So in a sense, we've gone back to the basics and said, well, infrastructure is so important for development, but doing it well is hard. So it makes sense for us to focus on that basic task and share experience across countries. Which leads me to my second question, or to my second point, which is that China has a particular experience in infrastructure that is to a significant extent relevant for many other developing countries, but also may have to be adjusted when you come to a different institutional environment. So I mean, China has very much driven economic development by building ahead. So in most developing countries, infrastructure lags behind and is sort of barely and usually not catching up with the demand. China, and of course I'm generalizing a much more complex situation, but China has a history of actually building ahead, building large infrastructure, and then economic development followed and was induced by that infrastructure. I think for many other countries, that is an attractive model. And yet, I think it needs to be modified or adjusted to the institutional realities of countries that I think have only, and again, we talk about a huge variety of country circumstances, have had, in some cases, great success following a similar path, and other cases not been very successful. And I think, in particular, I think institutional just capability of implementing projects at high quality and avoiding, therefore, the risks of complicated infrastructure have been at the heart of those, I think, necessary adjustments. So just some quick reflections on what is a complex set of issues. Thank you.
Thank you. If we don't have any additional comments, I can move to our next question. We have another interesting question from Joe Liu regarding the RMB currency. Could the panelists share their views on the role of RMB in development finance, and more specifically, the promotion of the RMB and now digital RMB along BRI and among BRICS countries? To what extent this could lead to the relative weakening dollar and development financing and the global financial system? Thank you. I know this is not an easy question. I'll leave it open to you if any of you would like to comment on that, and soon I'll bring some other questions on some different topics.
I'll give it a shot for 2 minutes and then hand over. It's obviously a very complex question, which requires maybe another hour seminar session for us to deliberate on. But in brief, there's no question that the renminbi, China is the second largest economy in the world, as you know, and given the size of China's economy at over $13.2 trillion and the extent of its export book, that the renminbi over time as a currency in terms of trade, finance, and so on will increase. the Chinese government decided on a strategy a good probably 10 years back. The idea was floated by the then governor to internationalize the renminbi more. And it only really gained traction sort of 2011, 2012, but it really got solidified in 2016 when the IMF formally adopted the renminbi as is part of the basket of currency in the so-called special drawing rights of the IMF. What that means is that those 5 currencies, central banks all over the world, Brazilian central bank, South African central bank, and so on, they can hold their foreign exchange reserves in either US dollars, in British pounds, in Japanese yen, in euro, or in renminbi. So for the first time, a few years ago, the RMB was included in that basket of currencies, which means that it will grow, but it will take a very long time for the renminbi to even go into double-digit levels. And the reason is very simple, that it takes a long time for foreign exchange markets to, in terms of the volumes, to move. About 75% or 70% of all transactions globally are still conducted in the US dollar. It is had this anchor reserve currency role since 1944. It's not going to change anytime soon. But the more important reason why China will be slow to adopt, or why the world will be slow to adopt the renminbi, is because the renminbi is not fully convertible as a currency. There's still capital controls here in China. I mentioned earlier on that there's still a series of incomplete. There's an incomplete reform agenda, which is now the next phase of China's reform and opening up. It's only when China removes the remaining capital controls that the renminbi will have the potential to become a currency that is more used in trade finance, that is more used as a reserve currency. No doubt it will happen, but it will happen at a much slower pace. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I would like now to move to the topic of sustainability and climate change. I have 3 very good questions here that I will present to you all at once to save time. And they're mostly aimed at Karen and Martin that presented broader views of the topic here today. But of course, the others can feel free to comment as well. The first 2 questions are from Isabella Teixeira. Isabella is Brazil's former Minister of the Environment, and she's currently a senior fellow at CEBRI. Her first question is, how can the infrastructure sector undertake an important role that will help develop solutions in the global sustainability and climate agenda? And her second question, which is closely related to the first one, is the development banks are co-responsible to help make decisions that will take the world to a more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient future. With that in mind, what decisions do you think that need to be made in the next 3 years post-COVID to avoid setbacks and guarantee that the transition will be faster and more effective for the world's transformation? And now a third question from Larissa Vachholz, who's the head of the China desk at the Ministry of Agriculture of Brazil. She's also a senior fellow at CEBRI. Larissa asks, to what extent the increasing environmental awareness we see in China under the tenet of ecological civilization may influence the incorporation of sustainability standards on Chinese-led financing? Karen, Martin, would you like to?
Sure. I mean, I think these are all great questions. What can we do to support, an accelerated green transition? I think we can prioritize the money, to go in that direction. Obviously, development priorities are always multiple, and there are sometimes ways to combine multiple goals into one. But in the programs in which I have worked in Brazil and now here in China, we try and achieve to the maximum possible extent climate co-benefits. We try and really do a careful assessment of the climate resilience of the investments that we're undertaking. We're gaining a lot of experience how to use analytical tools to get more robust indicators of climate resilience, of climate impacts, of carbon emissions associated with our lending. I think we can even go further. Quite frankly, we could even go further as institutions to use the crisis as an opportunity to rethink our business models. All of the travels to conferences needed, all of the travels to visit project sites needed. Can some of this be done remotely? Can we use drones? Can we use local partners more effectively? So there are ways in which we can rethink the way we do business to have, to have a greater or to have a smaller climate footprint. Now, how can we accelerate the green transition more generally? I do think we need to continue to make the case that there is no trade-off between greening and job creation, or at least there are policies that can be taken that reduces or completely mitigates that trade-off. As long as people feel that the green transition is going to come at the expense of their immediate economic future, that they're going to have to pay a price, that this is something that's done for richer people that can afford to think about it, the world will not make the adjustment quick enough. But we have increasing evidence that that is a false trade-off, that's a false dichotomy. And we, I think, need to advocate and demonstrate cases where that is not the case. And just to give you an example, in China, we're working with the province of Shanxi to accelerate their transition away from coal. And obviously, they're very concerned about the job implication that this may have, since a lot of people in that province are employed in the coal industry. But I think we have managed, together with Shanxi, to create an environment or a program in which alternative job opportunities can be created, which people can be retrained. There's a lot of experience from countries like Germany on how you could organize a just transition. So I think we need to talk more about these experiences, the great economic opportunities that alternative, renewable energy, that alternative technologies have, the opportunities also that lie in digital technologies that are undoubtedly going to play a bigger role post-crisis. So let me stop and leave the final question to Karen.
Thank you, Isabella and Larissa, for the great questions. I think more and more we see that different agents accepting or understanding the need for more climate-friendly policies or sustainable development and infrastructure playing a central role in this process, and not only because it's a moral imperative or because increasingly we see a change in mindset with newer generations that are demanding different policies, but also because more and more organizations that realize that not addressing these issues result in greater costs on their projects in terms of financial costs or delays in the projects, and also increasingly pressure from different investors to follow certain regulations or adopt policies or processes that are more in line, more climate friendly or sustainably friendly. The role that the multilateral organizations and specifically the banks have in facilitating this change and deepening this trend is beyond pointing this north. I believe it's providing innovative financial mechanisms that could induce induce behavior of these agents towards a certain direction. And I already mentioned in my presentation different financial and non-financial mechanisms, including some commercial banks in Brazil that have already adopted, but also another sign that these banks could give is thinking of sustainable infrastructure
Thank you, Karen. Now, before we close our session, as we're running out of time, I'd like to hand it over to Tatiana for a quick final question. And I'd like to kindly ask that the speakers answer the question in 1 minute, so we can close, and include their final remarks with their response, if you have any final remarks. And after that, Pio Borges can please make the closing remarks right after all the speakers have answered. And from my part, I'd like to thank you all very much again for participating in this session. I think it was an excellent conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you, Cynthia, and Karen, Joaquin, Martin, and Leslie. This has been certainly is among the highlights of our China analysis group in the last 3 years. It has been a fascinating session. I think we had more or less about 180 people with us today, which is a very, good number, considering, our topic too. And I wanted to close because you've seen in the beginning of our session, how many companies are members of CEBRI, right? And we do have probably many of those companies, CEOs, director, people that work with project watching us. I think it would be interesting, given the focus of, especially the new banks, in also in attracting private sector, helping and then helping the great challenge of bringing from billions to trillions. What would be the message to the private sector, to people that may have projects that they might think it's sustainable projects in different areas, especially, of course, of infrastructure? Who should look for, NDB, AIIB, and the World Bank in Brazil? What is the profile of companies and projects you would be looking for? And thank you very much. It's, as I said, a fascinating session. It's a privilege to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. I'll just be 60 seconds in line with the request. Firstly, to the private sector companies on the line, as you know, infrastructure as an asset class is now emerging as one of these kind of, underemphasized. Overall, most of the institutional investor pools of capital in the world today, maybe 1% of the investments represents infrastructure. There's attractive returns, firstly, in emerging market infrastructure. When I say attractive returns, I mean in the high single digits, in some cases, even in the lower teens. Secondly, we are ready to co-finance projects with other institutions in Brazil, for example, with CAF, with Inter-American Development Bank, with the national development banks. We do not have the capacity, in fact, to do it on our own. We are looking for partners. And then finally, we will, as I mentioned, be expanding the non-sovereign or the private sector part of our business. So we will, let's take our $2 billion per annum that we will be devoted to Brazil going forward. A large part of that we want to be going to private sector infrastructure and working with some of the companies who are on the line. Thank you.
So let me add to that. I think as the world and Brazil hopefully will emerge from the COVID crisis over the course of next year, infrastructure investments will naturally start to begin a very, very central role in economic recovery. I think governments and private companies will naturally look at infrastructure investments as an opportunity for generating employment and laying the foundation for recovery from the crisis. But the revival of infrastructure investments post-crisis is a real opportunity for accelerating the sustainability transition to low carbon energy transport systems, building more efficient cities. And I think that transformation is the key opportunity of the phase coming out of the crisis. And I think you will find in us a very eager partner to finance and work with those partners who want to accelerate that transition to sustainable infrastructure and a low carbon, no carbon economy. And I think that with recent announcements in China, the political change in the US, the global community is very much aligned, and we are certainly keen to partner with that. With that, thank you for a great invitation to this wonderful conversation.
Karin?
Martin.
You were next. You want me? Okay, I didn't want to jump over Karin. I thought she was next.
I just wanted to thank for the opportunity. I think this question is more for the development bankers, who to reach to in case companies have a project for funding, right? So Martin, please.
Sure. Well, I you know, one of the pleasures I had in Brazil was to attend the regular events of the GRI, a network of people looking at private investment opportunities and infrastructure and working with development banks to try and realize them. I think my successor continues to attend those meetings. I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunities to work together in Brazil. As there are around the world, we have the Global Infrastructure Facility, as many of you know, sitting in Singapore, that works on the structuring of some of these transactions. And they've done quite a bit of work in Brazil. As I said in my earlier remarks, it's difficult to do. I mean, at the end of the day, these are complex transactions. But as Joachim also said, I think as we're coming out of this pandemic, people will realize that building back better, and that means building, is a key part of how we're going to get out of it, particularly in countries that have chronic infrastructure deficits such as Brazil and many other parts of Latin America. So I think there should be plenty of opportunities for us to work together to build a more sustainable infrastructure going forward. And with that, let me thank CEBRI for this great opportunity to reconnect with Brazilian friends and to speak with such a wonderful panel. And I think by and large, we agree on most issues, so that's a good thing.
Thank you very much, Martin. I would like to thank Cynthia and Rogério for moderating the meeting. Special thanks to Leslie, Karen, Joaquim, Martin for a wonderful discussion. And of course, very special thanks to Tatiana for helping organize the meeting and conducting the China Analysis Group for so many years. I remember well, Martin, when I had lunch with Tatiana at Quadrucci in Rio, and Julia, to invite her to become the senior fellow of CEBRI and lead the China group. And I feel really emotional to see Tatiana leave, although she's going to a wonderful challenge with the new development bank. So thank you very much for participating, and good evening and good afternoon for everybody here. Good to see you all, and I hope to see you personally soon. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Pio. Bye-bye. Good, bom dia and good evening and good day to all.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.